In this video, we're going to learn how we can set a cover image for our trips to display here within the main trips view and allow our user to set a new cover image by either holding down on one of the images, what we call a long press. So that's going to set a new cover image, or they can set a new cover image via this More menu. So that piece of information, what image we're going to display for a particular trip on this view, we need to store in a field. And that suggests, of course, that we need to add a new field to our trip data type, and we can just call this our cover image, or maybe you might want to call it like a hero image. Doesn't really matter too much. It is, of course, type image, and we'll get to how we display it on our trips view in a minute. But first, let's just work out how we actually set one of our images as the cover. And one of the ways that we're going to let a user choose a new cover image is actually by holding their finger on one of the images here. That is what we call a long press. And it is another type of gesture, another type of way that users can interact with your mobile app. So to set up a long press, let's find the element first that we want the user to long press on, i.e. to hold their finger onto for some specified amount of time. And that is this horizontal list item on our trip details view. I can actually probably make this a little bit more descriptive and call it the horizontal list item image. And I don't actually want to hit add workflow here because by default, that's just going to add an is tapped type of workflow when we're after something slightly different. So I'm going to actually delete that. The one that we're after, we're going to create by hitting this new button within the workflow tab. And we actually are looking for under elements, an element is pressed. So when we set this up, we first choose what element it is that the user is going to do the long press on. So that's of course that horizontal list item image that we were just looking at. And then the other field here is the minimum duration. So how long do you want the user to hold their finger on this element before this workflow fires? And by default, it's just set here at 500 milliseconds, so half a second. We'll leave it at that for now. And let's just add our action, which is going to set this image as the trips cover image. So what do you think we would do? Well, pretty straightforward, right? We're going to make changes to our trip. So we're going to find the trip inside of that trip property, inside of our trip details view, which we've already set up earlier in the course. And then the field that we want to change is the cover image. And then what do we want to set as the cover image? Well, probably the image that they've done the long press on, right? So this guy here. So we'll set this to simply be the current item's image, right? The current item being this horizontal list item image that was pressed. So to test this out, let's just note that in my database right now, we've got this Italy backpacking trip, which does not have a cover image. Okay, the cover image is empty. If I hold my finger on one of these images though, for half a second at least, let's see what's in the database. So if we look at our Italy backpacking trip now, you see, aha, we have a cover image set. Brilliant. Now, in terms of our interface, maybe we want to add some kind of visual indicator that this image is in fact the cover image for the trip. So let's add a little icon to the image. I'm going to add it as a button, actually, so that I can make use of the style that we already created for semi-transparent icons. And the icon that I want to use, we could actually use a few different things here. Maybe we could use a star, or we could just use a little pin indicator. And let's set this to be fit width to content. Because this isn't a button, I'm not so concerned here about the size. So I might actually make this relatively small and change the icon size as well here. And you can see there how it looks. Right now it's appearing on all of the images, but we only want it to appear on the cover image, right? So try to have a go yourself at setting up the logic for displaying this pin icon on only the cover image. Otherwise, let's go through it together now. So I don't even need to call it a button really. It's an icon pin, and by default, not going to be visible. Instead, I want to add a condition under which it should become visible. So I'm going to add a condition here, and that condition, well, it's got to compare two things, right? It's got to compare the current image within this horizontal list item, so current items image. And then the other thing that it's got to be compared to is the trips cover image. And we're going to choose here actually the URL to make this work. So the URL, it's going to be a URL for this particular image. Basically is the same thing as the image. And we're going to compare that URL, the location for that image, with the URL for the cover image. So that cover image, of course, is on the trip, which lives inside of the trip details trip property. And so we're going to look at the cover image's URL. And if those two things are the same, then we can safely say we should show the pin. So I'm going to say this element is visible. And so you can see there's the pin on our first image here, but it's not appearing on any of the other images. However, if I now hold down, if I long press on one of these other images, you see that it becomes the new cover image. So that is quite handy. Now, this is maybe a little bit vague as an action that the user can do. They might not be super clear what this actually means. So it can be a good idea to add some kind of alert or visual indicator to let the user know what they've just done. And we can literally just create a sheet for this. So we might call this sheet new cover image alert, and just add a text element which says new trip cover image selected. Maybe we make this a little bit of a larger font size. We center it and we add a button that says close, let's say, just to close the alert. We give it this field like secondary. We add a little bit of padding on the sides of our sheet. So if things aren't too cramped all the way around, maybe even on the top and the bottom, we make sure that our sheet is fitting to content. And then maybe we also add a little bit of blur to the backdrop as well. Maybe this heading is actually a little bit too large, so I'll set it to be this instead. And we add some gap spacing as well. This is just like a really, really quick way of handling this. And then this close button is going to hide the sheet. So I'll say here that we're going to hide this sheet for the alert. And then literally whenever that long press action happens, this workflow here, which isn't really named that intuitively, so we might say new cover image as the name for this workflow. When that image is pressed, we also show that sheet. And what this means now is that if I long press on one of these images to select a new cover image, that I get this little alert, which I can slide down or just hit close in order to hide. And then what I also want to do here is I want to allow a user to, from one of their diary entries, to actually be able to, from this more menu, set an image as the trip cover. The main reason that I want to do this is because this behavior here of holding down on an image to set it as the trip cover is like just a tiny bit ambiguous. I want to give them a more obvious way of doing this. One of the reasons that I want to do this long press functionality in my app is to demonstrate it to you so that you can do it in your app. But for the sake of having a cohesive user experience, especially one that is going to give us the best chances of being accepted into the app stores, we should not have too many ambiguous actions in our application. It should be very clear to our users, based on how we've designed the user experience, what particular actions will do and how to take particular actions in our app, like setting the cover image. Is within my diary entry details view, and inside of my menu here, I'm just going to duplicate my edit button by hitting Command or Control D, depending if you're on a Mac or a Windows. And I'm going to set the icon here as an image. I'm going to set the label here to set image as trip cover. And so when this button is clicked, I want to find the trip associated with this diary entry, and I want to change that cover image field to the image for the diary entry that we're viewing here within the diary entry details view. So that means presumably starting with have a go, see if you can figure this out for yourself. Starting with a make changes to a thing action, right? That's what we're doing here. We're making changes in our database to our trip data type, specifically to this cover image field. Now, how do we access the trip? Well, we're inside of this diary entry details view, which gives us access to this diary entry property. And from a diary entry, we know that we have this relationship with a trip because a diary entry, of course, has this trip data field here. So we can not make changes to the diary entry, but in fact, if we click this little more section here, we want the diary entries trip. So we're going from the diary entry to the trip. And now on the trip, we want to change, of course, the cover image field. And what are we going to set that to? Well, again, it's just the diary entries image, right? The diary entry that we're viewing here. So it's going to, again, be inside of that diary entry views, diary entry property, and specifically it's the image field for that diary entry that we're setting as the cover image for its parent trip. And then, of course, just to round out the user experience, we will hide this sheet menu. And what this means is that if I now hit set image as trip cover, if I go back to my trip details view, I should see the appropriate image being pinned. And then the last thing, of course, is let's display that cover image within our trips view here. This was kind of the whole point, right? So we've got a vertical list item here, which is showing a trip's title and its start date. Let's add an image element as well within this vertical list item. This is, of course, going to be the cover image. And where are we pulling this cover image from? Drum roll, please. Well, it lives on the trip. The trip is in this particular vertical list item. So current items trip, and then the cover image. And because we're displaying this in an image element, not a group element, we've got different options here for how we display it. We want to choose here zoom. That's just the equivalent of cropping in on this image so it fits within the image element. And so this is how things look by default. A couple of issues. We've got this padding around the image, which doesn't look too good. We've got some spacing issues. And also we've got some trips that don't have any images, but we've just got this big empty space where there should be an image. So try to see if you can solve these issues on your own. Otherwise, let's go through them now. So first things first, let's get rid of this big empty space. Probably the rule here should be, hey, if this trip has a cover image, then maybe show this cover image element. Otherwise, don't show the element, right? Just collapse the element. So whenever we're doing some visibility rules like this, I always like to start by default with the element in question being invisible, and then we just add some condition under which it should become visible. So in our case, come on, you can write this. I know you can write this. Do it yourself. And you've done it? Okay, cool. Then I'm gonna do it too. What is it gonna be? It's gonna be, is the current items trips cover image not empty? In other words, there is a cover image for this trip. So in that situation, I do want you to show this image element. That's immediately gonna make things look a lot better. All of the vertical list items for trips that don't have an image already look fine. We just now need to finesse the appearance of the sky here. So what I want here is for the image actually to take up all of this space here. So I don't want these little gutters or this little padding around the image at all. So what we're actually doing right now is on the vertical list item element itself, we're adding some padding all the way around. We actually don't want to do that. So I'm going to remove all of this padding. We actually only want to add padding around these two text elements. So what I would normally do here is if I hold down Shift and select both of them, I can right click and put them together in a column container, a column group. And so now they're inside their own internal group. And I can just add the padding now to this internal group rather than to the entire vertical list item. So let's just add that same padding back. I think it was 12 on the top and bottom and 16 on either side. And you can see that's already starting to look a lot better. The image has some rounded corners at the bottom. I think that would look better if that was just squared off. So our cover image, if we look at what we've got here, we've got a roundness of 4 around all of the corners. Our vertical list item itself actually has some corner radius as well of 8. But what I want to do is on my image, I don't want to have this roundness of 4 all the way around, but if I set that to 0, then the problem that I have is that my image is now square at the top here as well, when I actually want it to be rounded off like this. It's kind of a little hard to see here, but you can see here there's definitely a square edge, whereas I want it to be rounded off. So try and solve this yourself. How do we fix this? How do we fix this? What settings could we have available to us here on screen to fix this? Well, we know we don't want to set the roundness for all of the corners at once. We just want to set the roundness possibly for these two corners, the top left and the top right. So perhaps define each border independently is the setting that we're after. Let's try, shall we? So we're going to tick this checkbox. Aha! Now look what we have. We've got what looks like some corner radius settings for each of the corners of our image. So perhaps top left, I could just set that to be 8, and top right, I could also set that to be 8, so that those two corners are gonna match the corners of my vertical list item. And my bottom two, I can just leave here as 0 because I actually want those to be squared off. Aha, now we've gotten somewhere, right? My top two corners are nice and rounded, whereas my bottom two are nice and square. Okay, just before we sign off, there's one tiny little detail here that's just slightly annoying me. The gap between our two text elements here is just a little bit too big, a little bit too big. And if you're going, oh, Matt, can we just let it go? Like, it's not that bad. I was taught if you're not gonna do a job properly, don't do it at all. So what have we got here? This bottom text element has a minimum height of 44 pixels. The problem with that, and you'll be able to see it accentuated if I make it even bigger, is the text is actually centered inside of whatever the height for the text element is. So that's meaning that our text element is actually kind of this big right now, with the text itself sitting in the middle. So we want to shrink that up. And so to shrink that up, we've already got fit height to content turned on, and let's just get rid of the minimum height. And I think that looks a lot nicer, a lot tighter. We also don't really need these delete actions anymore just while we're here, since we added the ability to delete a trip from this context menu. So I can actually just hit backspace on my keyboard with these swipe actions selected to remove them. Now, before we sign off, there's just one last little job that we need to do here, which is that on trips that don't have any diary entries with an image, as soon as they add their first diary entry with an image, that first image should become the cover image. And also, if they don't have any images, let's just hide this big blank space up the top. So that first problem, probably pretty easy, right? I'm sure that you can figure this one out for yourself. Otherwise, let's go through it together. So how I would solve this is that when this save button is clicked on this page, what we're doing is we are changing a diary entry from being a draft to not being a draft. And so it's at this point that we can say, okay, the user has said this diary entry should exist. And so it's also at this point that I think that we're safe to take whatever value that they added for the image for this diary entry and place that or set that as the cover image for the trip. So what action do you think that we would add here? Well, of course, we're going to make changes to the parent trip for this diary entry. So I'm going to set this to be the diary entries trip, okay? And by the way, we've still got this old trip property existing. We actually don't need that anymore. We could probably delete it, but let's not get carried away. Let's focus on the issue at hand. So we're going to make changes to the diary entries trip. What field are we going to change? Obviously the cover image, right? And what are we going to set it to? Well, we're going to set it to whatever value that we had set for the diary entries image. So the diary entries image. Remember that we're setting this image at the point at which the user either takes a photo with their phone or uploads a photo via their photo library. So either with the workflow that happens when this button is clicked, right? We're gonna open the camera and we're gonna save the result of that camera step to the diary entry, or conversely, if they're gonna choose from their existing photo library, then whatever image that they choose is gonna be the value that we save for the trips image. So that's why we can just simply port whatever value is stored on the diary entries image into the cover image value for the parent trip. But we don't want this to happen every single time the user saves a new diary entry, right? That's just gonna override whatever cover image they might have already explicitly chosen. So we only want this to happen when there isn't an existing cover image for the trip. So what do you think we would add here? Well, we would check whether that covered image is empty or not, right? So we would go and have a look at whether the trip, which we can get from going from the diary entry to the trip, and then we can check that cover image field and we can say, hey, is it empty? Only if it's empty will we set a value for it based on what the user has just chosen from their photo library or taken on their camera. And so if I test this out with a new trip, and that trip, of course, starting out doesn't have a cover image. If I add a new diary entry for it, and we can just add whatever data here, it doesn't really matter. I've uploaded an image, I hit create, then you can see that there is an image appearing here. It seems to be tagged as the cover image. And if I go back to my trips page, it very clearly is the cover image because it's appearing there for my new trip. So our app is full of beautiful images now, all supported by the fact that we are allowing users to take pictures with their phone and upload images from their phone's photo library. Now, the next step of the equation is allowing users to add a location to their diary entries so we can display that within the app and also show those locations within a map view. So we're going to start building this in the next lesson.